The colonization of the United States was fundamentally different from the colonization of India, Africa, and Latin America for several reasons. Settler colonization versus extractive colonization. The British colonization of North America, USA, and Canada followed a settler colonial model where Europeans migrated in large numbers, displaced Native Americans, and established permanent settlements. In contrast, the British, Spanish, and Portuguese colonization of India, Africa, and Latin America was extractive colonization. The goal was to exploit local resources, labor, and wealth without integrating the indigenous population into European society. Key difference: the U.S. was colonized to become a new European homeland for settlers. India, Africa, and Latin America were colonized to be controlled, looted, and economically exploited. Economic policies: who benefited? In India, Africa, and Latin America, the colonizers drained wealth and resources to enrich Europe while keeping local populations poor and dependent. In contrast, in the 13 American colonies, British settlers had more economic autonomy, could own land, and were encouraged to develop their local economy. For example, the British looted $45 trillion from India, deliberately deindustrializing it. In the U.S., settlers had businesses, farms, and some level of self-governance, even under British rule. Key difference: in India and Africa, the British saw the local population as a source of labor and taxes. In the U.S., British settlers were allowed to build wealth for themselves, which later made them powerful enough to demand independence. In India, Africa, and Latin America, Europeans ruled over existing populations and controlled them through divide-and-rule tactics, economic oppression, and military force. In North America, European settlers wiped out Native American populations through wars, forced displacement, and disease to make room for European settlers. The U.S. also had African slavery, where millions of enslaved Africans were brought to work on plantations under extreme brutality. In India and Africa, Europeans wanted to rule over locals and profit from their labor. In North America, Europeans eliminated the indigenous population and used enslaved Africans for labor instead. The fight for independence: why the U.S. won, but India and Africa didn't at the same time. The American Revolution, 1775 to 1783, succeeded because the settlers fighting for independence were themselves of European descent. The British saw them as political rebels, not racial inferiors. In India, Africa, and Latin America, the colonizers viewed the locals as racially inferior and incapable of self-rule. This made independence movements much harder and longer. The U.S. gained independence in just 7 years, 1776 to 1783. India had to fight for over 200 years, 1757 to 1947, to break free from British rule. Africa remained under European control well into the 20th century, with most countries gaining independence only after World War II. The U.S. settlers were of European descent, so they were able to break free relatively quickly. India, Africa, and Latin America were non-European, so the colonizers fought harder to maintain control over them. After independence, the U.S. quickly became a global superpower, while India, Africa, and Latin America were left struggling with economic devastation caused by centuries of looting. The British left India and Africa impoverished, with divided populations, weak infrastructure, and economies built to serve colonial interests. The U.S., however, already had an industrial economy, a unified European descendant population, and Western political institutions that helped it recover and grow rapidly. The U.S. inherited an economy built by European settlers for themselves. India and Africa inherited economies built to serve European interests, leaving them in poverty after independence. Conclusion: the biggest difference? The U.S. was colonized to become a new Europe. Colonists had rights, land, and economic control from the beginning. In contrast, India, Africa, and Latin America were colonized to be exploited. They were never meant to develop under colonial rule. That's why India and Africa remained poor after independence, because they were looted and exploited, while the U.S. became a superpower within decades.